Good morning, everyone. When I agreed to speak this morning, I did not realize I'd be following up a football player with a movie about him, but, roll with it. I am lucky enough today to have two friends and colleagues with me, Sherry Tracy, who's the managing director at Phoenix Advisors, and Francine Springer, who is the CFO at Wildwood Crest. All right, what we're going to do today is go over public finance basics, but also point out a couple pitfalls that happen quite frequently in bond issuances and authorizations. How many people have done a bond ordinance with their municipality before? Okay, how many people have done a bond issuance with their municipality? Okay, how many people find the credit call stressful? Okay, so we're gonna get over to that. Sherry's gonna talk about that at some length. A municipal bond is an indebtedness issued by a government entity promising to repay borrowed money at a fixed rate of interest over a specified period of time. I promise it will get more interesting after that. Bond issuances are a lot like your mortgage. That's the easiest thing that people can usually relate to. Shorter bond issuances are called notes. Sherry's going to talk a little later about when you want to issue a bond versus when you want to issue a note. Not everything can be bonded. Certain things can't be bonded. Capital improvements and other purposes can be bonded, but you can't bond for current expenses, like your salary. You can't bond for that. They must have a useful life of 5 years, which is why you can't bond for a current expense. You can also do refunding bonds, which are very much like when you refinance your mortgage. We'll talk about that a little later. And, excuse me, some Type 1 school districts have the municipality issuing debt on their behalf. If you have a Type 2 school district, you go through a referendum, and you might have voted on one very recently in your municipality. There are some quirks to the bond law, and one of them is that you can absolutely bond for this SUV, but you cannot bond for this car. It's a holdover. SUVs are considered trucks, and vehicles are not bondable. Next is the bond ordinance. The bond ordinance allows for lawful contracts and spending. There are two numbers that you'll always see in a bond ordinance, the authorization and the appropriation, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There is a part of the bond ordinance that will set aside the Section 20 costs. That's all the non-stuff and non-building costs. Your lawyers, your financial advisors, your engineers, anything that doesn't involve an item or a shovel is a Section 20 cost. When you allocate the Section 20 cost, it's a cap. Oh, thank you. The Section 20 is a cap on what you can use Section 20 money for, but you can overshoot your Section 20. One important thing to note, though, is that the Section 20 number appears in your publication. So if you have $1 million project and an $800,000 Section 20 costs, people might mention that when they see it in the newspaper. Everybody has that one guy that goes to their meeting. They are adopted in the manner set forth by the bond law, and they are different from ordinances generally. This is an important thing. Almost 100% of the time, the problem that we have when we're trying to issue bonds or notes is that there was a problem with the publication. What often happens is when you get a bond ordinance from your bond counsel, you get a packet of documents. The first is a cover letter, which you probably throw away immediately, and then the bond ordinance, which you keep, and then the rest of the stuff, which you leave until we call you and say, hey, we need all that extra stuff. The number one problem that we have, other than just typos, which just happen, is that a well-meaning clerk will use a regular ordinance publication instead of the bond ordinance publication provided in the packet. So what you have to do is use that specific publication that's given to you by your bond counsel and put that in the paper. And the other really important thing there is to make sure that the date of the public hearing is correct in that publication. A bond ordinance also amends your capital budget. What you guys are absolutely always involved in is the preparation of the supplemental debt statement. The rules keep changing, and what I hear a lot from my CFOs is that you guys really love the ever-changing FAST system. I get a lot of calls with great affection. There's a lot of F words on that call. Most of them are fast, but some of them are other. Fantastic. Usually the word's shorter. But yes, a lot of those words about the FAST system, they must be prepared and dated as of the date of introduction. I know some of you really enjoy finding out that bond ordinances were adopted without anybody telling you and with the date of introduction being passed. We usually work with you. That's not usually a fatal flaw, but it happens. They must be filed with the municipal clerk and then filed electronically now with the Division of Local Government Services. One of the biggest challenges that we see is some municipalities have a hard time coming up with that 5% down payment. It is a challenge, and we understand that. There are some ways to get around it. One, if you have a municipal utility, you're shaking your head, Brandy. If you have a municipal utility that's self-liquidating, which many of you have because I recognize a bunch of you, for a pool, water and sewer, beach, my favorite, beach utility, those if you have a self-liquidating utility, you can avoid the requirement of having to do a 5% down payment. Additionally, if you go through the New Jersey Infrastructure Bank, how many of you have done that? Okay. That's another way to move around. One of the things that we have started putting in our ordinances is two things. If you have a self-liquidating utility and you're borrowing through the Infrastructure Bank, there have been some challenges with the Infrastructure Bank lately, so if you get a bond ordinance from us, it'll say that you don't have to make a down payment because you're going through the NJIB, but also FYI, we're self-liquidating. Might be something you want to talk to your bond counsel about adding. Sometimes it comes up that you need both. If you want to, say, borrow for a project outside of the trust, you want to have that, or the bank, you want to have that double information there. Bond ordinances can be introduced by title. Excuse me. One of the things that we talked about a little bit before is the publication after first reading. The number 2 problem is the public hearing date being incorrect. It happens all the time. It's a miscommunication. Some municipalities skip a meeting in between the introduction and final adoption for a variety of reasons. It's completely okay to do that, but you have to be in lockstep communication with your clerk's office and make sure everybody's working together. Checking how I am on time. Okay. Final adoption. It's after a public hearing. You have to have a separate hearing, so there's always a public hearing portion at your meeting. You also have to have a separate hearing on the bond ordinance. It has to be passed by 2/3 of the full membership of the governing body, and it must, after publication, you have a 20-day estoppel period where your bond ordinance is deemed to be final. And that is the other thing that we talked about up there. You see where the form approved by the LFB. We give you the form approved by the LFB. All you have to do is plug in a couple of pieces of information. Most bond councils will give you that, make your lives easier, and make sure your clerk is using that. There's a conclusive presumption after the 20-day publication estoppel period. We have used the conclusive presumption a little bit more lately. A couple things that you cannot conclusively presume. If the publication of the final let me just start that one more time. If the public hearing date is incorrect, that doesn't work. The best thing to have go wrong is that the final publication is wrong, because all you have to do is republish that final publication, wait 20 days, and you're good. This is a bond ordinance. Just a couple quick tricks. The thing that I always used to mess up when I was first doing this is the appropriation and the authorization. The appropriation is first in the alphabet and the bigger number. The authorization is last in the alphabet and the smaller number. The authorization is what you're allowed to issue in bonds or notes, and the appropriation is the amount that your budget will change. These two numbers, I'm happy to email a copy of this. I have a longer presentation where I go through every element of the bond ordinance. However, I have two great guests with me, so I cut it down to a couple. If you would like a step-by-step of a bond ordinance, come up after. I'll give you my card. You can email me, and I will send you each individual one. I'm trying to just hit the couple pitfalls. One of the helpful things here, in most bond ordinances, you'll see what the vote requirement is, so you'll know right at the meeting, because who can remember? You can read it very quickly. So if you get half the people voting in favor of it, that's not enough, and you'll be able to say at the meeting, nope, we need to re-vote, or this doesn't pass. We talked about this already, and I'm going to try and skip ahead. There are two kinds of purposes in the ordinance, single and multi-purpose. A single purpose looks like this. A multi-purpose is a giant graph. The main difference between a multi-purpose and a single purpose is the amount of stress and sweat it takes us to figure out the useful life on a multi-purpose, because we go through individually and figure out what the different useful lives are. Both are completely acceptable. You'll see in a multi-purpose ordinance, the purpose section is several lines long. In a single purpose, it's just that one little thing. And it says two things. One, what you can do. Here it says acquire, and two, what you're acquiring, which is the ambulance. This is the part where it says, you guys do everything. This is the part where it lists all of the things that have been delegated by the governing body to the CFO. It's a good little checklist, so you know all the things you can do. You can be part of negotiating the rates, you can be part of the ratings call. This is a very important part for the CFO. You can issue temporary financing or permanent financing. There was a period of time where you had to go back to the governing body every time you wanted to make these decisions. This delegation section allows you to just take over. This is an important part, maybe not right now, because Sherry will talk about how taxable and tax-exempt rates are getting a little closer. Declaration of intent. If you have a project, let your bond counsel know. If you acquire something, or you start a project, or do anything other than the initial cost with your engineer, lawyer, architect, you should let your lawyer know so they can do a reimbursement resolution ahead of time if you're not quite ready to decide that you want to do a bond ordinance for it yet. This section is the declaration of intent that we include in all the bond ordinances. You should check and make sure it's in your bond ordinances as well. This allows you to maintain your ability to borrow at a tax-exempt rate. People have budgetary problems and like to look back in their notes and figure out what they paid for and then figure out how they can finance them. This is the reason the IRS doesn't want you to do that is so you can't refinance the pyramids when you have a problem with your current budget. So that's what this section is. Effective date. You'll notice as you're about to do a bond or note issuance that your bond counsel and our paralegals will constantly bug you about getting the records. We'll bother the clerk, but we'll also come along and bother the CFO to make sure that we have them. All the bond ordinances have to be finally adopted and have a 20-day estoppel period run after the publication to make sure that we can issue bonds or notes under them. Bond anticipation notes. These are short-term debt instruments. Sherry is going to talk about, which I think is really helpful, when you want to issue bonds and when you want to issue notes. It's an important decision, and there are a lot of variables. It's really helpful to have a good municipal advisor to get in there and help you with that decision. The NJIB has a variety of programs. Another thing that you should look for in your bond ordinance, there's a provision that says that you can borrow short-term notes for up to 1 year. Make sure that your bond counsel is making that change in that section to say, unless otherwise amended by applicable law. We include a section in all of our bond ordinances now after the NJIB changed their rules so that you can do one note issue for up to 3 years. Who knows what other programs will change? So you just want to make sure in your bond ordinance that you note that you might be able to go out for longer than a year. It's helpful so you don't even have to question that when it comes along. They can be renewed. Sherry's going to talk about the decision about whether or not to renew notes or not. Is this when you're popping in? We also can do the issuance of bonds. Bonds are a longer term financing. I think the shortest one I've ever seen is 5 years. I don't think I've ever seen one shorter than 5 years. They're at public sale. They're sold by electronic auction. There are 2 options to sell at an electronic auction. One costs money and is more fun, so nobody does it anymore. And the second one is a sealed bid. Grant Street is an eBay type bidding process. It's very funny because it's a 15-minute window when you can bid. So what happens in that 15-minute window is your bond counsel and your municipal advisor will try to dazzle you with everything short of tap dancing, because the first 12 minutes are excruciating when you are absolutely positive you're not going to get any bids. Then, for the last 30 seconds, you get 1,000 bids, as if everybody just woke up, and they go back and forth and keep going down and down. And it's very exciting and very fun, but it costs money, so people don't do it. The other, way more boring but free, is parity. Parity is a sealed bid. Everybody submits their sealed bid. You see who has bid, but you can't see their bids. And then at 11 or 11:30, whatever time the sale is, they all pop up at the same time. Makes us much less uncomfortable, which is probably less fun for you guys. But it's very straightforward. You get your bids and it's done. Sometimes we'll see certain changes being made by the municipal advisor at the last minute. We'll get into that if we have a little bit more time about premium. And there are certain maturity schedule parameters, and there are fixed interest rates. Additionally, there's a 2% deposit, a down payment requirement for a good faith deposit for bidders. Bidders have to submit to your finance office. I'm sure you guys all love when that happens and you get a bunch of random wires for $168,000 or something along those lines at 10:30 the day of the sale. It's extremely stressful. They wait till the last minute. They're calling you 100 times to make sure you got the wire. Goes back and forth. We figure out who's available and let them bid. And the reason there's the 2% deposit is that so I can't call and say, yeah, I've got $8 million, I'll figure it out, and then come back and figure out that I don't have $8 million. If you've got enough for that 2%, you've probably to just wire to a CFO, you're probably in good shape. Okay, you want to? Sure. Okay.
And just to touch on too, as Erin was talking about the 2 different formats for selling the bonds, we'll work with your professionals and your municipal advisor and bond counsel and auditor and sort of in that discussion as to which format fits you best. Sometimes, we see smaller issues or issues with weaker credit. Maybe we just want to go with a single bid route because we're not sure, we may have 2 or 3 bids and we want to make sure we're going to get the very best bid. With the auction platform, in a market where there's a lot going on, a lot of different sales on a certain day, and your credit might be a little weaker and the sale's a little smaller, we don't want someone to, we don't want anyone to miss bidders. We may not want to use that platform because the other bidders are going to know there's not as many people bidding, or they're going to get that sense, and so they may start out with a higher rate and wait to be pushed to lower during the auction period. The single bid platform, you're getting the best. Because they only have one shot at it. So just to kind of add to that. With the issuance of bonds, they do require a bond rating. Probably most of you in here have a bond rating. If you have sold bonds before, or if you've gone through the iBank, you've needed to sometimes go get a credit rating in order to just go through the infrastructure bank. We'll talk a little bit about that process. Francine's been through it a lot. It's definitely not scary. The analysts are wonderful to work with, and we'll go through that whole process. You can combine issues for sale. So if you have general improvement, you have utility debt that you're doing, you can put them all together as one bond issue, set up a separate series of bonds. So they can be sold, helps aggregate the issue, provides a little size, and again, that will generally help you in the market a little bit with a little bit larger of an issue. There's a continuing disclosure requirement on that. I'm sure probably a lot of you are very familiar with that. That's requiring putting information onto EMMA, which is the Municipal Security Rulemaking Board, their website, to tell investors. It provides annual information about your municipality, so it keeps the investors in touch with your financial condition.
I think you mentioned Sherry's partner, Anthony, has a panel on Friday on continuing disclosure too.
Yeah, so we'll go into that in more detail. I I won't really go into detail on that, but that is part of a bond issue. When you do a bond issue, you do enter into that agreement. You do make that promise to provide your information to investors. Bond insurance, this may be something that fits for you or doesn't fit for you depending on your credit rating. That's just a credit enhancement vehicle that can help to raise your rating if your rating is lower than, say, AA, AA+, where some of the bond insurers are rated. It may be worth the investment to purchase the insurance. It wraps your bonds with a promise from the insurer to pay in the event that you're not able to. While you don't have that expectation, you wouldn't be able to. What it does is helps your bonds sell at a lower rate in the market because now they've gone from maybe a single A3, A- level up to a AA plus in that range. So that's something that can be evaluated. Bank qualification, that's a special designation for selling bonds if you're issuing less than $10 million in a calendar year. There is ongoing arbitrage and rebate compliance. This is kind of starting to, while it's always been there, it's starting to kind of come back around in discussions. I think we're hearing a lot more of it because of the fact that short-term interest rates are moving higher than they've been. You know, we spent many years down below 1, below 50 basis points. And so there really wasn't a concern, even though the obligation was there to track the arbitrage or the possibility of arbitrage, which is earning more than the bond rate that you're borrowing. It really hasn't been a concern for most of you in the last 10 years, but that's starting to come back around because now we're seeing bond issues at 2% and interest earnings at 2.10 or 2.15, and so there is going to be that requirement to track that. So just make sure you're talking with your professionals about that, so that if you do have a liability, you're tracking and reserving for it. And the other point with bonds is typically if you're going to sell bonds, it's going to take probably at least 60 days. Bonds is not going to be quite as fast to be able to get to the market and sell as short-term notes would be. Notes you can do pretty quickly, really within a month, I would say. Yeah. But bond issues probably going to take you at least 60 days, and good if you have a little bit more time than that.
And it's always unfortunate if you get trapped into selling notes because you didn't have enough time or there was a problem on the bonds, particularly if you're doing any new money. Where your bond counsel might not have reviewed their ordinances yet, you should definitely allow for more time in case you have to republish or readopt or something along those lines. But I think we usually send out notices with enough time to do a bond or note sale, but it's really good to stay on top of that so you know.
Yeah, and I think there's been some cases, I mean, we worked with several municipalities this year because we'll talk about interest rates in just a second, but because interest rates have dropped so low this year and so quickly and just this sort of this steady downward decline in rates, that we had a lot of municipalities that were not planning to bond, but once they saw rates come down 100 basis points, they had notes coming up for renewal, and they said, wait, note rates are the same as bond rates? Maybe now's a good time to lock in, especially since I'm already starting principal paydowns on the notes. So in a lot of cases, we just roll those notes out 3 months, 4 months, 2 months, something to give us time to be able to get to the bond sale. So not so much that it really wasn't really actually in the plan for 19, but interest rates kind of helped speed up the plan a little bit for the bonds. So that's an option. Who's involved in bond or note sales? So mayor, CFO, clerk are all going to be required to sign documents when it comes to closing for the bond issue.
It's always helpful to be mindful of vacation, especially in the summer. We always have issues. There's always a way to deal with it, but that is another pitfall of everybody was there for the pricing and then everyone goes on vacation for 3 weeks and we're tracking people down in Florida or the Jersey Shore to try and close, and no one wants to be bothered with this stuff. There's always a way around it if you're a little bit proactive.
So who else is involved? Your municipal advisor, your auditor, your local counsel, your bond counsel, and then you're going to have either the underwriter or the purchaser for the bonds or notes. So when do you issue bonds versus notes? Francine and I think we'll both kind of talk on these. There's many factors to consider. One of them I think is looking at your existing debt structure, and do you want to touch on that? I mean, I think some of the things, when you're looking at what's happening with your debt, do you have a bond issue that you're paying off? Is all of a sudden your debt service going to go from $3 million next year down to, $100 or 500,000, maybe, and you have notes outstanding already, maybe it's time to convert that.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Sherry said, definitely review your debt service schedule. That's something that I do right before the end of the year, most definitely, to make sure that I know in the next year what is coming, maybe falling off on your debt service, and should I go out for short-term borrowing, or can we make room for long-term issuance? So definitely planning, I can't stress that enough, like really communication. I know that Sherry just mentioned that. Definitely communicate with your clerk, with your governing body, with all your professionals, your bond counsel and your financial advisor, just so that everyone's aware of what you may be doing during the year, and then you can get on their radar screen as well. They are definitely on the pulse of course, Sherry's going to know when the interest rates are, how they're doing. She may say, let's step it up. Let's wait until the end of the year to issue. So that's definitely something. And definitely with planning. In our municipality, and I also worked in county government, I make sure that we had a 5-year plan. So I would look at that plan, see what was coming up, especially you can plan out your bond ordinance. You'll also know if I have a bond ordinance coming up in the next year, I need a 5% down payment for that. I can budget for that and kind of already look at that in advance of the budget. And also planning with your other professionals, meet with your administrator, your governing body. You don't know what they have in the works that you may not be aware of. So it's always good to communicate with them so that they are aware of, and you are aware of the projects that are coming up. So you're not caught in the middle of the year trying to do a bond ordinance for $10 million and you don't have enough in your down payment. So I can't stress that enough. To just communicate and planning. Also look at your cash flow. That's definitely something that would cause, you might have a ban, you might have to do a ban because now you have no cash to get to the end of the year. So definitely, look at your cash flow at the end of the year. That'll give you a heads up as to when to choose a note or maybe even do a ban. You may be forced to do one if you have a large project coming due. In the next year. So that's definitely something that I definitely look at for planning purposes.
I think the other thing too, we mentioned is interest rate environment. So that's, I think, has encouraged a lot of you to go to the bond market this year. Yeah. So this is a graph up here. This shows this is a composite interest rate of municipal bonds sold across the country. There's a 20-year rate on the top, that's the blue line, and the 1-year rate is on the bottom, the green line. As you can see, way back in 2014, they were very different. 4% difference between what you were getting on your notes and where you may be with a bond issue. So I think a lot of you certainly were doing notes. There was certainly more reason perhaps to do notes in 14, 15, 16, as those note rates were so low. I think a lot of you were getting rates, 50 basis points, as we said before, sometimes under that. So the note borrowing was very, very cheap. And bonds were fine. They just weren't quite as cheap as the notes. There wasn't as much as incentive to get to the bond market unless maybe you had debt coming off or it was time to do a large project. Now, as you see, they have converged. So the difference between a 20-year bond rate and a 1-year note is about 0.5%. There's really not that much different, 50 to 75 basis points right now between where you would be in the market with a bond and a note. As I mentioned before, some of the shorter bond issues, 10, 12 years, we've been seeing almost equivalent to where the note rates are. Certainly better than where your note rates were a year ago. So that's another reason you may want to get to the bond market. I mentioned earlier, some of you maybe weren't planning for bonds this year, but ended up taking advantage of these rates and locking them in. It certainly was and is a great opportunity.
And the bonds are sort of a set it and forget it kind of thing, whereas the notes you have to come back every year. You have to pay your professionals every year to the extent you need them for each thing. And so if you do a bond, you're done. You just have to make the payments and sort of keep an eye on whether or not they can be refunded.
Mm-hmm. This next graph just shows, these are a couple yield curves. So this is just from the 1 year up to the 30-year rate. That green one on the top, that's a year ago. So as I mentioned a year ago, if you follow across the 1 year versus following across where we are right now, currently on the 30 year, you can see those rates are pretty much the same for the 1 year versus where we are the 30 year today. So the red line going across, that's the current market. The yellow is a month ago. We hit a low, actually the lowest interest rates for municipal bonds since they started recording municipal bonds. That was about a month ago. That was like kind of mid-August timeframe. Since then, they've come up a little, 25, 30 basis points, but we're still in an extremely favorable market right now. And that purple line is just 2 months ago. So it kind of gives you, we're sort of moving in that same space, but big difference from a year ago. And a year ago, I think we didn't think rates were that bad. So it's, we've just, it just really shows how low they've come. So next, we're going to get into the credit rating review process. So this is something too, Francine's been through this a lot, just recently again, certainly a lot with the county and then recently with Wildwood Crest. So, this is a process I feel like I think sometimes in talking with clients, it feels a little bit intimidating, but we don't want it to be and it shouldn't be. How do you go about it? So there's several rating agencies you could work with. How do you select one? So what fits best for you for your municipality? A lot of times it's who you've worked with before. So you have a current rating already outstanding. I think that's something that you would look at. Generally, you're probably talking with that agency, with that credit rating agency every year, every couple of years. They're checking in, seeing how things are going, whether you're selling bonds or not. Talk with your professionals. Does the credit assessment seem right? Is it fair? And that doesn't mean, are you all AAA, and if you're not, then you should change, because that's not, there's certainly other factors that contribute to that. So it just means looking at and again, working with your professionals. Both Moody's and S&P are very open with the matrix they use, the way their credit criteria. So it's wonderful because it's opened up in the last, I want to say like 5 or 6 years for us to be able to kind of go behind the curtain a little bit and see how it all works. Again, talking with your professionals, one agency may put more weight on debt. Another may put more weight on policies or practices that you do. And so depending on, you may come out differently with either rating agency, just again, depending on the situation of your municipality. Some of you, particularly counties in general, will have more than one rating. Some municipalities have more than one rating. It's okay to do if you're issuing bonds every 7 years or 10 years, and you're issuing less than $10 million. You probably don't need two ratings. It's going to get a little expensive for you, and also that means you're continuing to keep those ratings in place for the life of the bonds, which means you're going to be talking to, while they're very nice people, you're going to be talking to the rating agencies every year for each one, or every 2 years for each one. So that's a lot of time. You probably don't need that for that situation. But again, counties have 2, sometimes 3, and larger municipalities and larger debt issuance. Sometimes you want to go out to the market and tell them, 2 people think I'm this good. Again, all conversations with your professionals as you're preparing for that. I mentioned the scoring matrix and the criteria, very important in reviewing as you're preparing for the presentation, for the call. What you're going to do is looking at those matrix and knowing what are they looking at, what are they focusing on, because it's not an evaluation of you as a CFO and how things are running just in a vacuum. It's larger. It's your entire tax base. So it's important to know, what are the things they're going to focus on? What are the questions they're going to ask you? It's just not just strictly on the operations there. A lot of different factors go into it. In preparing for the credit review. So the first thing that happens is generally we'll submit some financial information. So Emma has been great. I mentioned it before, the MSRB's website, because we post all of your documents up there. All of your financials, particularly if you've sold bonds before, are already out in the marketplace. so the rating agencies have access to them. However, we'll also send some recent documents to them, your last few years of audits, maybe your AFS if your audit's not done yet, depending on the time of the year. Certainly your preliminary official statement, which is the legal document or prospectus about the bond issue that you're undertaking or the note issue. And then any other relevant information, demographic information. If you have a lot of pilots in your community, those numbers are not going to show up in your assessed valuation, and they're not going to show up, particularly in a lot of places in the analysis unless you go and share that. So some of that information you want to think about and to prepare and to be able to share with the rating agencies, let them know the whole story. And then deciding, do we do a phone call? Most times we do phone calls. I think we're pretty lucky here in New Jersey because all the rating agencies have offices located right in New York, so a lot of them either know New Jersey, live in New Jersey, familiar with New Jersey, so site visits are probably not always required because they generally know a lot of places. They come down here, so they know they get to see a lot of the state on their way. So, but sometimes it is
I
important.
bet Miami gets a lot of site
Yeah.
visits. If I had to
probably
guess.
are,
San Diego.
But sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's good, particularly if you have not had a rating in a while, or maybe you're switching to a new rating agency that you haven't worked with before, or you have a lot of new development.
That's what I was just gonna say.
Yeah.
Definitely with new development, I would have them come down.
Yeah.
And I think it will help your rating.
Yeah, take a look, show them what's going on. You can certainly always ask them to come down. They're always willing to.
One of the other helpful things is you can always ask them for the questions ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
So always,
Yeah.
No, I was definitely going to add on that into what I was going to say as well. Definitely, the questions will come in advance. You usually have almost a week sometimes to gather your information, talk to your professionals that maybe your tax assessor you need to reach out to, or some other professional, your engineer, maybe talk to your administrator because they may know there might be a question on there, and just make sure you know what your debt service is, your fund balance. Those are going to be questions that they're going to be asking. So those are things to definitely look at and plan for while you're planning on, going out for a rating.
oops, sorry.
Oh, that's fine. So as you're preparing then, building our presentation, that would be the next piece of it. We're going to get ready to either, whether it's an in-person visit or it's a rating call. What are we going to do? Well, first I mentioned the scoring matrix before. Let's use their rating criteria as a guide. They're not trying to trick you. They're telling you exactly what they're going to evaluate, what they're going to look at, and as Francine and Erin both mentioned, they're going to give you your questions and topics in advance. So we have time to prepare, put some information together for them to show them already the information that they're going to ask about. It makes things go a lot smoother. It's a lot easier conversation if we kind of use that scoring as a guide. Also, think about some specific things you want to highlight. We mentioned before development, some new things that are happening in your town or your county, some things you really want to highlight and share with them. In addition to that, if there's some weak points, some pressure points, let's talk about those too, because they're going to see them. So it's better if we just kind of come out, we address them, and we say, yeah, here's what's going on. Our assessed value's been going down for the last 6 years, and this is not a positive trend. They're going to see that. They're looking at that already. So let's be prepared to talk about it and talk about what's happening. Maybe we're working on a reval and that's going to fix it. It's happening because of tax appeals or whatever the situation is. We have a plan in place to kind of fix it and work for it. So just be prepared to talk about those points too. You can always provide follow-up information after the call. So if you're ever on a call and there's a question you don't know the answer to or you didn't have ready, or it's a question that maybe wasn't on the list and something came up, you can always get back to them. Just say, or you want to check with somebody else in the administration, just say, I'm going to follow up with you on that. That's absolutely no problem. It doesn't show that you're not prepared or anything. Don't worry about that. It's just that questions do come up, and sometimes you want to make sure you have the specific, correct, and detailed answer to provide the best feedback you can. At the end of the call, typically you'll schedule a time to be able to review the report and to sign off on it. So the rating agency is going to go back to a committee a committee. They're not the ones, the analysts you're talking to, maybe one or two people on the phone. They're not going to be strictly the ones making the decision. They go back to a committee of their peers, generally from across the country, and they're going to be presenting the rating and why they think this is the appropriate rating for you. And then it's going to be a discussion. And from the feedback I've gotten, sometimes they're quick discussions and sometimes they're long discussions. So it depends. But at the end of that, your analyst will prepare a report, and it's very important for you to look at that. For you to look at that, have your professionals look at it. We want to make sure there's we can't change their opinions, but we can certainly change factual. If there's a misstatement of a fact, we need to fix that. Or some confidential information we shared with them that we asked them to keep confidential, and accidentally it got into the report. Something with negotiations. We said, oh yeah, we're going to be all set. Everything's going to be wrapped up tomorrow night. We're at 2% on the police salaries, but you don't have a contract yet. You probably don't want that in a report. So those kind of things you want to review it for. Anything else you wanted to add on that?
Just with the review of the report, most definitely read over it and take your time, like looking at all the facts. I just had one 3 weeks ago, and we did make some changes on that. Definitely in the verbiage, there was just some verbiage that I didn't think was favorable, and I didn't understand. I think there were some instances where it just wasn't clear what they were trying to put forth. So they did rework that and reword it, and it really worked out to our benefit at the borough. So definitely take the time to read over that, and make sure you schedule a time that is good for you, that you're not, it's not during your committee meeting or your,
Usually
commissioner
about
meeting.
2 hours that you
Because you
get
do
to
only
review
get
it.
2 hours, and they do release it. I don't even think they require you to respond back. I normally do respond back and let them know that I did review it and my questions, if there are any, but I don't believe they'll just release it after the 2-hour period.
Yeah, they will try to work with us, certainly touch base, check in. After a certain period of time, they will need to, because it is something that, especially if there's a rating change, that can't be kept, that has to be released out to the public, particularly when there's bonds already outstanding for your entity. But yeah, they'll try to work. We'll work with us, and we'll check in and make sure. Just really, I think wrapping up on this, I just wanted to include for you. These are just 2 graphs. The one on the right, my right, your left, is the distribution of New Jersey municipalities, the bond ratings. So as you can see, most of you are probably AA minus. That tends to be just about what most municipalities in New Jersey are. The graph over here, am I right? Or am I right? Is Moody's. This is a national rating. So this isn't just New Jersey, but this is national distribution. So again, you can see AA2, which is equivalent to the S&P AA, tends to be the median score for municipalities. So again, the national, and just to kind of give you an idea, those tend to be, they're high ratings, and that's most of them tend to be right in that AA2, AA range.
I think when we were putting this panel together, I thought it was really important to get a team together. You should have a team together too that you're confident in, and planning is really helpful. I don't want to call out Dawn Bass, but she puts together all the ordinances once during the beginning of the year, and figures out everything she's going to borrow over the course of the year, how she's going to borrow it. She's right over there if you are looking for somebody to consult on these things. We come down, the auditor is there, local counsel's there, the whole team is there, their head of rec, DPW, the whole team is there, so they figure out all of their ordinances and how they're gonna borrow over the course of that year. It's really helpful. Don't be shy about calling. You'll end up saving yourself in the long run. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. If you want a copy of an ordinance and how to go through everything, let me know. We charge by ordinance, so if you have questions about the ordinance, you should feel free to call. And it's really important to get your team together. It's also really great to have colleagues that you can ask in case you want to ask a question that you don't want to ask a professional. Everybody here is really great and wonderful to work with, and it's useful to utilize your network.